Hello friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history 20th century. In the earlier lecture on Russian Revolution, we talked about the background of the Russian Revolution, that how Russian Revolution was one of the first socialist revolution in the world. What was the kind of treatment which was meted out to people by the Tsars, and the incompetence of the Tsars was one of the reasons for the Russian Revolution. And we find that with the coming of the socialist revolution in Russia, it also paved the way for other countries of the world to turn to socialist ideals. And we also find that in the later part how Russia as well as America became the superpowers. So in the course of our discussion, we'll further talk about from the point where we left behind in the first discussion on the first lecture on the Russian Revolution, and how we find that the kind of rule which Russia had in the framework of autocracy, and how people were not on its side. And we find that when the autocracy was overthrown, and how a provisional government was formed in Russia. And we find that how Russian Revolution is also seen in the framework of a proletarian revolution, because of the fact that how workers and peasants, both of them, they played an important role in the Russian Revolution, and some members of the bourgeois also supported the Russian Revolution. So in that sense, when we try to see that initial part, we find that it was a bourgeois democratic revolution, and the provisional government initially that was formed was dominated by the bourgeois and the landed aristocracy, and it represented their interests. So this provisional government did not bring any change in the policies of the autocracy which was there before that. So we find that the coming of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and we are also talking about the 1905 revolutions which took place in Russia. And with the coming of the provisional government, we do not find that much change came. And we find that how the political freedom was granted during this time, and we find that the February Revolution had also resulted in the formation of the Soviet of workers, peasants and the soldiers' deputies as in 1905. And when you talk about such kind of Soviet, we find that how the working classes of Russia, their interests, they were being represented in this. And we also see that from the beginning there was a conflict between the two as well, which lasted up to the October 1917 revolution, when the provisional government was overthrown. So we find that the provisional government was not a successful one, which was prior to the 1917 revolution. And it was in the period between February 1917 and October 1917 that conditions were prepared for proletarian socialist revolution. So in that sense, the proletarian revolution which took place in 1917 October November was an important development in the Russian history. And we find that from the various sections of the society, people, they became conscious about their solidarity and their common interests, like workers, peasants and soldiers. They all came together, and how they were also opposed to the provisional government, which now stood exposed before them as an agent of the ruling classes. So we find that this was an important stage in the Russian history, and many of the revolutionary groups, they also wavered. For example, the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, and how they were representing the interests of the people, but they did not realize that people were far ahead of them in that sense. And they also did not realize that it was also a time when the time was ripe for a socialist revolution. That was the second stage of revolution, which took place in October 1917. And we find that how it was also not seen that bourgeois was already against a further advance of revolution, because they had supported the earlier revolution, but now they realized that the workers, peasants and others, they wanted a complete revolution, and they did not want any kind of a hand of the bourgeoisie in this. And bourgeois also realized that a further revolution was not in their interest. So it was imperative from their point of view that they try to halt any kind of revolutionary changes which can be brought about in the Russian society. And the Bolsheviks were the one, those who were able to realize this kind of a situation. They were the only political group to give kind of a voice to the aspirations of the people and to put forward the demands of the time. And we find that when they realized this, they realized the pulse of the people and how their demands, they were also reflecting their ideas when they were talking about putting an end to the war, because Russia was a party to the First World War, and how Russia realized that they had to come out of the war, and they did not want to continue in the war, and this too was to be done without any indemnities which were to be paid by Russia, and any annexations in which Russia was not interested. And they were also talking in the framework of the land for the peasants, workers, and how the workers, those who are landless workers, and the peasants as well as those who were landless, how they had to be given land, and the workers, they were to be given some kind of control in the industries, and when they will be given some kind of a share or control of the industries, then only they will be able to prosper. So we find that how the right of those nations for the self-determination was being talked about, and we also find one of the important aspects of that period was the non-availability of bread or the food. So that was one of the most important aspects, that they wanted bread or food for themselves. And during this particular period, we find that when the provisional government was there and the provisional government became a failure, during this time Bolsheviks realized the importance and how the kind of ideas which were being talked about during this particular period also in a way reflected the understanding of the Bolsheviks of the pulse of the people, where they realized that when these kinds of ideas they will be discussed in the society, when they will be given some kind of a thrust by the political parties or the leaders, and then they will be able to achieve the objective of the revolution. So we find that they talk about democracy, they talk about peace, they talk about land, and all these kinds of ideas, bread, etc., they were being talked about, and they became some of the widespread slogans during these times. And how Bolsheviks, they were able to provide leadership to the people, and they gained some kind of majority in all the mass organizations of the people. And we find that the workers, peasants, and soldiers, they were also on the side of the Bolsheviks during this time. So we find that when you talk about any kind of a revolution or the success of any kind of revolution, then it has to have some kind of a popular base. And with regard to Bolsheviks, we find that the people, they were with them and they were supporting them. And when we talk about the importance of the Russian Revolution, that how Russian Revolution was an important event in the framework and the kind of changes it was able to bring about in the long term as well as short term, then we find that how this kind of a revolution was trying to destroy the basis of the capitalism, and capitalism as a world system was not liked by the socialists, and they did not want that capitalism should survive in Russia. And that is how we see that they also talk about the ideals of socialism, and they laid the foundations for socialism in Russia. But when you talk about these kinds of ideas in the framework of the policies, the kind of changes which came about in the various policies which were followed in the Russian society, then we find that how private property ended during this time. Because when you talk about the economic things, then we say that how private property, which was an important component, was being removed, and the ownership now will be held by the state. All the property will go into the hands of the state, the ownership will be in the hands of the state. And but it also did not mean that the belongings of the people, personal belongings of the people, they will be taken away from them. But rather we find that when you talk about the private property, that all means of production from the point of view of the sources of profit, income making, they were converted into the state property, which was an important development during this time. That how when you are controlling the means of production, then the kind of profits which are occurring can be divided by the government as per their wish or requirement. So it was an important development during that particular period. When you talk about the sources of profit, income making being converted into the state property, and how the state will take care of the income, and it will decide about the distribution of income as per its own policies. And we find that during this time, how the factories, land, banks, etc., they were being taken away by the government, and they were not to be owned by any of the individuals, so that the exploitation of the labor to make any kind of a profit could not be undertaken. So we find that the idea of profit making, as is seen in the capitalist industries, was to be removed in this, and how the exploitation of the labor which was happening in these private enterprises was to be done away with. So we find that how the revolution established the workers' control over the industries, and how the workers, they became some sort of partners in these industries, in that sense that the income from these industries will be divided by the state. So in a way, they were not the partners as they were getting any kind of profit, but they were in a way trying to see that how workers, they were able to secure control over these industries, because the state had the direct control now. So in that sense, they could keep some kind of a check on the production process as well through their representatives, and also ensure the rights of workers in their factory. So this kind of a change was a welcome change, because in the earlier period we find that how the capitalists, they were able to exploit the workers. So we see that when is keeping some kind of a check on the production process through the representatives, then the rights of the workers in these factories, they were also being ensured. So it was some kind of a new change, keeping in mind the earlier society, and we realize that such kind of measures, they were based on the understanding that those who produce must have some role in the decision making through the representatives right up to the central level. So the right of the workers to be part of the decision making process was a new development during this time, and how they were being given some kind of control over the industries, their participation in the industries and the production process was a new change, which we find as an important development, as an economic aspect during this period. And we also see that how the introduction of the centralized economy was an important component, that how the needs of the whole country, particularly the working class, they were to be taken care of, and when their economy was to be centralized in that sense, then they will be able to control the resources in a far better manner, and they will be able to control these resources for the benefit of the workers and the other marginalized sections of the society. So these kind of changes which were brought about during the Russian Revolution were an important development from the economic point of view. And we also find that when you have a centralized economy, they sought to guarantee a much faster pace of economic development and the fruits of that development to vast majority of people, and they sought to prevent anarchy in production and also avoid wastage as well. So we find that when you are talking about the centralized economy, when you are trying to have some kind of a guarantee in the framework of the economic developments which are happening in the country, and how the fruits of this kind of a development, they also reach the vast majority of people, they become the co-sharers of this kind of a development. So it was being thought about in during this time, and any kind of anarchy in the production process was to be removed, and any kind of a wastage which could have occurred in the production process was to be avoided at any cost. And one of the important features during this particular period we also find was in the framework of the 5-year plans, which were introduced in 1928, and it was an important component in the framework that how Russian Revolution made an important contribution to the world, that how planning also was introduced in India. We find that the first 5-year plan came in 1951, and this kind of a model was adopted for the planned economic development. And we find in this context, in agriculture, land was nationalized. This means that the land was owned by the state and given over to the peasant for the hereditary use. So we find that this was a kind of a change in the framework of the nationalization of the land, and the land was now to be owned by the state, and the peasants, they will work on the land, and it was being given to them on the hereditary basis, where their succeeding generations will also get that land, but the ownership of the land was in the hands of the state, and because of which we find that the land could not be sold or mortgaged by the agriculturalist, and it will also not be used to exploit the other labor or to earn profit for oneself. So it was a kind of a development where the peasants or the workers, not the workers, rather the peasants, they had to work on the land, and at the same time they had to take into account that how they will not sell or mortgage this particular land, and at the same time any exploitation of the workers will also not take place. And we find that the land decree of November 1917, landlordism was abolished and land was handed over to the peasantry, and the collective production and a further advance in the social relations within agriculture was made in 1928 with the collectivization of agriculture. So we find that these kinds of laws, decrees also in a way helped to bring about this kind of a change, where we find that any sort of ownership of the land in the framework of landlordism was abolished during this time, and how peasantry was being given this particular land, whether the small peasants or the landless peasants, now they were being given land so that they can cultivate it for their own good, and this will in a way also lead to some kind of a development. So in a way it was based on the principle of egalitarianism, and we find that when these kinds of changes they were happening, then we find that in 1928, with the arrival of the collectivization of agriculture, we find that a thrust was being given to the collective production, and in this some kind of changes in the social relations also came. And we see when one is talking about destroying the private property in the means of production, revolution also destroyed the roots of social inequality, where we find that people, they are not going to own the property in their own names. So it in a way talked about the classless society, where each was paid according to his own work, and the gap between the salary of a worker and the manager was not much now, and between the worker and an artist or a teacher. So that way we find that some kind of parity, where we find that everyone had some kind of equal salary, or equitable salary was there. And if you compare it within a capitalist society, we find that there is a difference in the framework, where we find the standard of living of the workers and the directors in the same enterprises, there is a huge difference. And if you compare it with other sectors, doctors, teachers, engineers, then the standard of living are remarkably different. But when you see it in the framework of the socialist economy, then you will not find much difference, as all of them are more or less similarly paid. So we find that when the Soviet state came, then it also provided the social benefits to all the citizens by guaranteeing them such as the free medical care, which was an important requisite for the citizens, and the free and equal education for all, again a very important kind of a measure which was needed at that time, and an unemployment allowance which was being given to the people, those who could not find jobs, those who were there but they were not having any kind of a job, and equal access to culture and cultural advancement, where we find that all people, they are being given these kinds of facilities or some kind of an access where their cultural advancement can take place. And we also find that these were the rights of the people in that sense, and how they were being guaranteed by the constitution as well. And but when you talk about these aspects or the kind of changes which came in the economic sphere or the social sphere, we find that not everything could be made available to the Soviet people immediately, as the production and the infrastructure for these provisions were being simultaneously created during this time. But one has to also give importance to the fact that the state took responsibility for an individual's good life provided he worked according to his ability. So, in that sense, any kind of changes which were to be introduced in the lives of the individuals in terms of the positive changes, so they were being in a way guaranteed by the state, and the state was determined to take measures for these kinds of changes. And we find that with regard to gender, or in the field of women's equality, we find that they were also being given equality which was guaranteed by the constitution, and but the material basis for this equality was created to implement it. And we find that when you talk about the kind of facilities which were being given to women, then there was a provision for 6 months maternity leave, crutches at the places of work, public canteens at places of work where food was cheap and subsidized, etc. So, these kinds of changes which were being talked about, the kind of amenities which could be provided to women during this time, how women they were not only getting the maternity leave for their own health, but we find that after they had their children, then and women when they are going to work, so crutches were to be established so that they can concentrate on their work, and at the same time children can also get some kind of a quality place where they can be left. And we also see that there was also a focus on the public canteens where cheap and subsidized food was being given to the people. And all this was aimed at making possible the fullest participation of the women in the public life. And we also find that all this had a great impact on the capitalist societies later as well. So, it was not restricted to the socialist, but we find that these kinds of developments, they also happened in the capitalist countries as well. And when you talk about the Russian Revolution, we not only talk about the economic aspects which are attached, we also talk about the social aspects, as we have talked in the framework where we talked about the situation of women. And we also see, when you are talking about the society which is a socialist society, then the welfare measures, they are also being talked about. And when you talk about the welfare measures, or the idea of a welfare state in the West, and it was a direct response to the Russian Revolution and benefits that it granted to its people. So, we find that the working people of the West would have immediately recognized superiority of a socialist society. So, in that sense, we find that it also impacted the Western societies to bring about these changes in their own sphere. So, it was a welcome development from that point of view. We will talk further about the Russian Revolution in our next lecture. Thank you very much.